Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about album number 2 from Four Tet, Pause. Alright, now it's really time to get into the stuff people were looking forward to for this series. Hebden had already established himself to be pretty good at this whole plunderphonics thing with his debut dialogue that showed a fair bit of versatility and could convincingly stitch together samples in a way that could sound like a real band was playing. But that project can still feel a little rough around the edges in many parts, not every sound blended together as effectively as the next. It's his second project where it feels like he really upped the ante, though, doubling down on his attempts to make sample collages sound like a real band, and succeeding with much more impressive results. Pause, often credited as the album that really first put Four Tet on the map, is the kind of album that you could pick up not knowing anything about the artist in question, listen to it and think you're getting some interesting folk band record instead of like a hip-hop producer or DJ or anything like that. All of these sounds blend so much more cohesively than they did last time, as if the whole album was being performed by the same band instead of feeling like a patchwork of lots of different ones. It led to this project frequently getting hit with the label folktronica, in the way that it could evoke such a warm and organic sound despite having been created just through electronic means. Now, this album is absolutely nothing flashy or overtly trying to impress anyone. It's still very low-key and intimate and nostalgic stuff, and honestly, I don't even think I could begrudge someone if they heard it and just thought it was boring. There are moments on this thing that sound like they wouldn't feel out of place in like a McDonald's commercial or something like that. It's very pleasant and inoffensive and not particularly attention-grabbing or deep or complex. You could even call it background music if you like. But for inoffensive background music, it's really consistently engaging. It hits all the right emotional notes for me without ever feeling corny or insincere, and perfectly nailed the vibe it was going for. It's concise, well-focused, just all around a really nice listen, with no real duds or weak points to speak of. And certainly wasn't bad to have around as something to marginally warm me up in the middle of this freaking ongoing snowstorm season. So yeah, may as well just go through individual tracks. Glue of the World is a much more indicative tone setter than The Space of 2 Weeks was. Pretty much lets you know everything you need to know about the kind of album you're getting. After an intro of some typing sound effects from some old school computer keyboard, you get a mix of shuffling near-organic hip-hop beats, with lots of plucking acoustic guitars and other stringed instruments like that. Very low-key, a few moodier jazz chords here and there maybe a few licks that feel like little rays of sunshine peeking out over the horizon in the morning. Do-do-do-do-do. Not a lot to it, but it's produced in such a way that the mix is a lot fuller sounding and not as sparse as it really is. I would not say this track is like infinitely replayable or anything. Its simplicity did kind of lead it to being the kind of thing that would marginally shrink on me the more time I spent working on this video, but I certainly never got outright sick of it. The rest of this album pretty much just follows variations of the formula set by this track, all going for the same sort of vibe as that one. Some tracks have more texture and life put into them, like 23, with all of its twinkling and chiming bells going over some light but oddly energetic Rhodes piano progressions. The acoustic guitar acting as a bass line, tiny vocal chops that somehow form a hook despite being barely present at all, and one very nice trumpet solo as well. But there's also tracks like Parks, which get most of their power from their sparseness and simplistic melodies. Not typically a lot going on with that one at any given point beyond the cellos, typical hip-hop beat, ascending and descending keyboard melodies, and reverse guitar samples. Oh yeah, and field recordings of what sounds like kids playing in a playground. It's kind of a slow, plodding track, but it's always consistently stuck out to me as one of the most replayable and well-executed moments on this whole project. Quite possibly my favorite track on here, period. There's also a similar contrast between these two tracks and the much more directly related cuts, Untangle and Tangle. The former of those two is the sparser and more simplistic one. For the most part, it's just a really simple drum machine and some bass with harp plucking going up and down, and that's pretty much it. But it does still kind of stick out in my mind. And some pretty similar harp melodies are also explored on the latter track, but this time they're plucked a lot faster, not nearly as meticulously. If you were to put it on sheet music, it'd look a lot denser with a lot more notes. But at the same time, I also feel like Tangle is probably the weaker cut of the two as well. It's not actually that much more complex in its construction, doesn't really deliver any ideas beyond that core sample of harp plucking and reversing it and making a fake ending out of it, and some odd field recordings that happen in between. But still, it is a pretty cool touch to have these two tracks that do in fact live up to their related titles, especially when directly compared to each other. Both are quite nice. As for other cuts, there are two tracks back-to-back that particularly feel like single material. Everything Is Alright may not have actually been a single, but it feels like it could have been. Kind of like a repurposing of some of the same ideas as Glue of the World, but much more upbeat. Just a simple acoustic guitar loop and a nice sorta airy piano loop going over some banging, echoing drums. And it's about as much of a mood brightener as that title would imply. That one's always been a particular highlight. And then there's No More Mosquitoes. The actual single from this thing that was released separately. And if there's any track on here that you're never gonna forget what it sounds like, it is this one. I mean, the others were plenty catchy enough, but this one especially. The oddly heavy drum breaks going up against the looped kid vocal hook makes for a mix that really stands out from the crowd. And not to say it's one of my absolute favorites on here, it can be maybe a tad repetitive and feels like a bit of a silly novelty track in comparison with other moments on here that can hit with a more emotional impact. But it's certainly the most easily memorable track in the bunch and even doesn't feel out of place among these other tracks either. Very good. It's very good. The closing stretch is also just as solid as anything else. Your penultimate cut, You Could Ruin My Day, is one of the most well-textured cuts in the bunch, with its loops of 60s harpsichords and flute riffs and other various plucked textures and melancholy guitars. Not the catchiest track here, but it runs on for a good 7 minutes, and its melancholy brushes of sounds never get boring or stale. And that's contrasted with the much more pleasant tones of the closer, Hilarious Movie of the 90s, which was a track that I admittedly went off and on with for a while. Those mixes of jangly guitar chords and glockenspiels are the most, like, McDonald's commercial soundtrack ready moment on the album. But those samples of, like, slightly more lo-fi bell sounds that open up the track, and the way he stutters those guitars do make for a more interesting counterweight to those other elements, is still a nice and satisfying way to finish the album, even if not one of my biggest go-to favorites. Still very nice. Oh yeah, and there's also two quick ambient-ish interludes in Harmony 1 and Layla Came Around and We Watched a Movie. They're nothing special, but do add an extra bit of flavor that's certainly a nice addition. I like how the former reprises the keyboard sounds from the opener as well. And yeah, that's pretty much all I got. This really isn't the kind of album that merits a lot of deeper discussion or gives me much to break down. A lot of the appeal is right there on the surface level, and if you can't get into the core vibe of sunny nostalgia, then it doesn't really have much else left to offer. But I think the general consensus is that said vibe is really easy to get into regardless. It's just an album that can make you feel nice, and it doesn't need a lot of dense or complex arrangements to pull it off. It's not ambitious, but who said album music needs to be? Four Tet made a name for himself making relatively unambitious music because he had just such a strong grasp of the fundamentals. The mixes are simple, but all the core elements that go into it are done really well. There was a part of me who went into this review expecting to praise it even more highly than I actually am, since a lot of these tracks do have that really solid foundation of nostalgia built in from when I first started seriously getting into Four Tet way back in like my freshman year of college. And his warm, sunny vibes just worked absolute wonders for me. And you know, maybe the dead cold of winter and getting buried in like 12 feet of snow is not the optimal conditions for me to really get into an album like this. But even with all that in mind, I do have to say it still pretty much all holds up in the way I remembered. Now granted, I do have a much stronger and more vivid connection to his next album, which I feel was an even further improvement on the formula set by these first two. We'll get to the next one. But yeah, Pause is as effective a mood brightener as you've probably already heard. Definitely one of the stronger points in his catalog, and I'm overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.